Am I allowed to quote Duterte's, when he says, "fuck the Pope" or
Oh, yeah,
everything?
yeah,
Are
yeah.
there rules?
Oh,
That's
absolutely,
perfect.
yeah.
Hello, welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. What comes next? There's a lot of talk today about a supposed global wave of far-right authoritarian populism. Putin, Orban, Erdogan, Duterte, Trump, now Bolsonaro. Supposedly these make up some sort of nationalist international. But this is a sort of self-aggrandizing statement made by opportunists. Does anything actually unite these figures? It might seem like a global wave now, but as we learned speaking to today's guest, Nicole Curato, it's only because these figures are appearing in the global core that suddenly people are paying attention. They've been a fixture of the global periphery and semi-periphery for quite a long time. So instead, we reckon we should try to understand the specific national contexts that give birth to such phenomena, before we go around asserting some general worldwide tendency. So that's what we're doing today. We're speaking to Philippine academic Nicole Curato about Rodrigo Duterte's rise, his support, and his rule so far, and then we're venturing some comparisons. Alright, welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga. I'm Alex Hochuli. I'm in Sao Paulo. Joining us today are regular Alpha Bunga Bunga producers and co-hosts, Ben Fogel, who's in New York, Phil Cunliffe, who's in Canterbury, and we're recording this quite early in the morning because we're talking to Nicole Curato, who's in Canberra. Welcome, Nicole. Nicole has conducted research in the Philippines for 5 years, is Filipino herself, and observed the election in 2016 in the Philippines and talked to Duterte supporters there. Now she's based in Canberra, where it's late at night. Hi, Nicole. How's it going?
Hi there. Not too bad.
All right. So today we are talking about Duterte and the new authoritarianism. This is an episode that we've been wanting to do for actually quite a long time, so we're really happy to have Nicole join us. What's given this, I guess, extra impetus is that Duterte is not the big baddie in the global scene anymore because he's now, I guess, been replaced by Bolsonaro this past week. So we want to actually draw out a lot of these comparative issues, and so maybe that's a good place to get started. So Nicole, as a bit of a starter, we're going to get back into this into more depth later on, but maybe as a starter, just to paint the picture, how does Duterte compare to other authoritarian right-wing leaders around the world?
Well, I think what's interesting about Duterte is he's actually a politician who first normalized the language of violence when it comes to his public pronouncements. And even more interesting is how he actually acted on these violent pronouncements. This is a man whose campaign promise is to say, "I will kill all drug addicts." And he's actually acted on it. It's actual state policy to have a violent crackdown on drug addicts. A lot of scholars actually start thinking about the unique characteristics of Duterte's so-called authoritarian tactics in one of Asia's oldest democracies. But I think one of the most insightful comments here that makes him a bit unique from other populist leaders is a comment made by Walden Bello that he's really a fascist original, because usually when we talk about fascism, it's always within the language of creeping fascism. But what Duterte does is quite the reverse. He's actually done a fascist blitzkrieg right away. He started with a very violent policy without having that creeping element. He just went into that really deep dive into these policies. So I think that kind of sets him apart, because if we think about Orban, for example, there was still a moment that, he was still trying to fit himself within the paradigm of liberal democracy,
Right,
until he suddenly declared that I'm building an illiberal democracy, if that's a paradox that actually makes sense. And we see this with other leaders again. Like if you think of Trump, he will try to push the envelope and see where the boundaries are. So that's in a way also a category of creeping fascism. But for Duterte, it's the reverse. He begins with a violation of civil and political rights. And then, he begins with indiscriminate repression, and then it kind of goes the other way. So I think this is kind of an original, I guess, tyrannical innovation that he put on the table.
That's a spicy take, and I do want to come back to that and also particularly the question of fascism. But let's move on to the drug war, because that's the other thing that most people will know about Duterte, will know about contemporary Philippines. He came in with this promise of blood right from the start, dehumanizing the perpetrators of the drug war, whether it's drug users and drug traffickers. So I guess first off, how real is drug addiction and drug trafficking as a problem in the Philippines? And what does this drug war represent? Because it seems a little bit quixotic to make that the core of your politics.
Right. Well, the official statistics actually demonstrate that that the rate of drug addiction in the Philippines is lower than the global average. And in fact, Duterte's own people, the Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency, did affirm that. But then when Duterte got into power, suddenly the numbers got mixed up. He would talk about inflated numbers of drug addicts ranging from 3 million to 4 million. And it's as if these numbers have no meaning. But that's important in terms of creating this scenario of panic that the Philippines has become a narco state already. But I think this is an interesting topic because one of my findings in my own research when I talked to Duterte supporters was that the issue of drugs has been very personalized for the longest time. It has been an issue that has not been discussed in the public sphere. So, for example, it's hard not to be sympathetic when I talk to, for example, a woman in her 20s who works late night shift in a call center, who would really change her route when she walks back home because she's afraid that the crackheads in the street corner will just start harassing her. I can't blame another respondent I talked to who keeps on making excuses for her neighbor because her neighbor's jaw was smashed by her husband. Because he was high on crystal meth, and this person can't talk to me in our scheduled interview. So all of these narratives are already very present. And I think it was quite confronting to me when suddenly Duterte became a popular presidential candidate. I thought, why? Where did this drugs issue come from? I think it's manufactured. But when I look back at the transcripts that I had collected 2-3 years before Duterte became president, I realized, oh my God, I wasn't paying attention, that this has really caused so much anxiety to so many people, but no one really listened to them. But what Duterte did was to actually politicize a very private issue and basically divided a wedge, not just between addicts and non-addicts, but the bigger narrative here is he drove a wedge between the virtuous people, the people who kind of tried to do everything to earn a decent living, versus the unscrupulous others who just try to get an easy life by selling drugs. So it's not a class war, although of course we can say that the war against drugs is a war against the poor, because obviously most of the people who are killed in the drug war are from the poorest communities. We have yet to see a big boss of the drug syndicate to be put behind bars. But nevertheless, it's not a class war when we talk to some respondents who think that, no, this is an issue between the good Filipinos and the bad Filipinos. And in a way, that's a rhetoric that's common for a lot of populist leaders, the way they drive the wedge between these immigrants who are freeloaders versus the good Americans who really tried to build the country.
I have a follow-up question on that point. So what is the relation between this drug war and the structure of drug trafficking and organized crime in the Philippines? Are these drug syndicates extremely powerful? Are they connected into the state? Has there been a purge of the state? Or is it something which is really just aimed against users and low-level dealers rather than the actual people who are making money, of which I presume is mostly the crystal meth trade?
Right. Well, it's hard to kind of give a definitive answer to that question, but there are indicative studies that demonstrate that the drug war is really part of a bigger, what they call shadow economies, economies of underground trade, arms dealings, drugs that fuel a lot of, let's say, powerful families in ungoverned contexts. I think one of the most interesting things about the Philippines is that despite the impression that Duterte is this very powerful president, the reality is you have local warlords posing as local government officials like mayors and governors who treat their own provinces as if it were their fiefdoms. And a big part of it is, again, being involved in the drug trade and the arms trade, having their own private armies in order to sustain themselves in power. So I think you're right in pointing out that the drug trade is more complex. It really is very much part of the fabric of society, whether we talk about politics or economy. And of course, we have to talk about the global character of this. So one of the main issues actually in the Philippines now is how come big time smugglers from China are not being arrested. Is it because Duterte has very close ties with Chinese investors and he's just willing to look at the other way so as not to jeopardize these investments?
That's really interesting, Nicole. This is Philip. So it's fascinating to hear about how the issue about drugs is something that was present in many ordinary voters' minds. So I was wondering, from the outside, like we say, we get this image of this incredibly kind of crass, offensive, deliberately kind of self-consciously offensive politician in Duterte, who's made all these, who's kind of normalized violence and unleashed the police and the drug war. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about if there feels to be a difference for ordinary voters in the Philippines under Duterte's rule, if they shift, if perhaps they feel reassured by the new climate, or if they feel afraid by how the police have been empowered. Could you just kind of paint a bit of a picture for us of what life is like for ordinary people now under Duterte?
Right. I think that's a difficult question to answer in the sense that if we look at the surveys, then we get the impression that, yes, this man is a very popular president. But if we look at the survey historically, it actually shows that any president in the Philippines, with one or two exceptions, always enjoyed this level of popularity rating 2 years into their presidency. So in that sense, Duterte is not that unique. If you compare him to his predecessor, the reformist, very well-mannered Benigno Aquino, he actually has a similar popularity rating same time in his presidency. But you're right to point out that what sets the difference with Duterte is that despite everything he's done, he's still very popular. And so when I talk to poor communities as part of my research, their responses are actually very varied. And I think this is an important insight when we talk about communities who support populist leaders, because there's this impression that if the leader is crass, then his supporters are crass. Well, not necessarily. I worked with disaster-affected communities, and what they see with Duterte is, yes, they recognize he's a crass leader. They call him a badass. Some of them call him an idol, as they would call an action star, as they would call Keanu Reeves. For some reason, Keanu Reeves is so popular in the Philippines. But that level of admiration when it comes to the celebrity who's a hero, who's out there to save the masses. Because he did give that impression when he helped out disaster-affected communities when he was still a mayor. He didn't have to do that. He was a mayor of a different city, but he helped them out quietly, with no fanfare, with no selfies, with no entourage. And that really stuck to them, that there's this man who is a man of action. And for them, they're willing to just forgo of the crass language because, there are redeeming qualities of this man. But of course, that's not to say that that's not how a lot of people think. I've also talked to some Bisaya. Bisaya is the language that Duterte speaks. And he always uses that as an excuse that my language is like this because the Bisaya language is crass. But when I talk to the Bisaya, they would also reject that and say, no, actually, the most beautiful poetry, the most eloquent proverbs are actually from the Bisaya. So that can't be an excuse. So I guess what I'm saying here is that we cannot generalize what the popularity of the president means. Everyday life, the everyday moral calculations of a lot of Filipinos really vary. And I think ultimately it's a moral, ethical decision that they make, whether the language of this man can be excused for other redeeming qualities.
It's fascinating. It really is. And it really helps to kind of build up a picture for people who aren't familiar with the Philippines. Just one more quick question is about the institutional basis of his rule and its legal basis. So could you tell us a little bit about his political party, its current standing in Filipino politics, and also what the legal basis for the drug war is?
Right. I think one thing we have to remember about Philippine politics is that political parties do not matter. The wedge is always in relation to kinship ties or families. So it's very common if you're talking about a small city to ask not which party is in power, but which family is in power. So we often call elections as a mechanism to moderate inter-elite competition. Right. And Duterte is not that different. His sons, two sons and a daughter, are running for different positions in Davao City, where he used to be mayor. So I can, of course, give a characterization of Duterte's party. In fact, there are two parties supporting Duterte. One is PDP Laban, the other one is a local party based in Davao. And I think where the base is coming from is a regional base, that a lot of his supporters are coming from southern Philippines and the island of Mindanao. And that is the island where Duterte is from. And it's very symbolic to get that support from this island, because this is a conflict-ridden island, and Duterte actually holds the promise of being the president who actually understands conflict in southern Philippines, because he was able to make Davao or transform Davao City, where he was mayor, as the murder capital, to a peace and order paradise. At least that's been the narrative. So in a way, that has been the basis of his support, the promise of being able to deliver peace in the South, and his party really builds on that support base. In terms of the legal basis of the drug war, well, there have been, in a way, there have been legal memorandums that kind of give legal underpinning or legal legitimacy to his campaign. I actually really like the term John Keane uses to describe this kind of strategy. He calls it new despotism. New despotism is a kind of despotism that tries to couch itself with a legal language to kind of still pretend to be democratic and use the language of democracy to justify authoritarian measures. My colleague from Griffith University, Lee Morgan Besser, calls this sophisticated authoritarianism. It's not that crass. Mm-hmm. So in the drug war, for example, of course, there have been accusations that they're not following the rule of law, the police is just unhinged. But you can also see the police trying to justify why they had to shoot at suspects. They would say, well, they fought back. And they would even go to the extent of manufacturing evidence to show that they fought back, right? If this were an authoritarian regime, they'd be like, yeah, we don't care. They also show some indications of listening. So when there's a public outcry against, for example, shooting a teenager as part of the drug war, there were huge protests. The government rethought the policy, paused it for a bit, and then regroup. So I guess there's this sophisticated character of this regime as well, that it's not just your old-fashioned retro type of authoritarian, but really a kind of authoritarian practice that also appropriates democratic mechanisms to re-legitimize its rule when it's being questioned.
That's really evocative, Nicole. I'm actually kind of taking notes as we're going along here, noting down new despotism and sophisticated authoritarianism, because I think this would resonate with a lot of people observing the scene, maybe not just in the Philippines, but elsewhere in the countries that we've already mentioned. I wanted to dive in a little bit maybe into Duterte's biographical history, at least in so far as we're talking about his mayorship of Davao, where he was a mayor for a long time. And his model for the whole country is this so-called Davao model, as my understanding goes. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Right. And I think for this narrative to fly, I'd really have to blame the Philippines' neighbor, Singapore, right? I think a lot of Southeast Asian countries just look at Singapore as this model of look what happens when you give up your civil liberties
Not
and
just
political
in Asia,
rights.
I have to say.
I know. Yeah. I mean, I've got friends from Australia who relocated to Singapore. And then when they come back to Australia, they're like, oh, take out my civil liberties. I just want the trains to run on time. Because it's a very
It's
terrible. A very compelling narrative, right? Yeah. So Davao is kind of pitched as, the Singapore of the Philippines. And like I mentioned earlier, the island of Mindanao has the stereotype of being a conflict-ridden area. This is an island where you have secessionist groups, where there are a lot of terrorist groups as well, linked to global jihad. Just recently, the city of Marawi, I think last year, or a year and a half ago, was actually had a similar situation with Mosul, where you have ISIS-inspired fighters taking over an actual functioning city, which led to 5 months of airstrikes between government forces and ISIS-inspired militants. And so this has been, the history of southern Philippines. But there's this man who really was able to transform one city in southern Philippines to become one of the most competitive cities economically in the Philippines. It has gotten rid of petty criminals through the standard Duterte form of governance. And I think what's interesting about the Davao model is that they were able to use what they call vigilante groups, or basically paid killers, to get rid of drug addicts and petty criminals and get them, and have them killed or intimidate them to leave the city. And they're not actual members of the police. They're not associated to the state. And so it's kind of hard to pin the accountability to Duterte. There's plausible deniability. There's this very interesting clip that Human Rights Watch always refers to when Duterte said, "I am the death squad, that is true." And for some lawyers, they consider that as, oh, look at that. That is evidence we can use in international criminal courts that he admitted that he is the death squad. But this is where Duterte's rhetoric becomes interesting, because he was actually, at least some of his close people who are close to him, the way they interpret that was, this is Duterte being sarcastic. I'm the death squad. Come on, find evidence that links me to the death squad. And you can't
take him seriously, not literally, as the saying goes now.
Exactly, right? And the same expression they use for Trump. But that's the point, right? It's hard to pin accountability on Duterte, but he was able to get away with it. So when these killings happen in Davao, the police's role is to just not show up, or just not show up in time to arrest any of the killers. And I think the difference now when you scale up that model to the Philippines is that you can only hire so many death squads, right? And this is why the police as an institution has to be part of the drug war and be at the forefront of this. So now this is an official police operation, although we still see some vigilante killings. But so that's in a way the story of Davao. And this is not to say there are no real gains in Duterte's rule in Davao. They're very proud that they've cut red tape, they've cut bureaucracy. But the other side of the story is that, data also shows that Davao is not really drug-free, that there's still a huge drug problem in Davao, even now that it's being ruled by his daughter, Sara Duterte, who's now the mayor of Davao, who replaced her father.
I'm just going to jump in here. I have a couple questions more about this Davao model. Is there a specific link between the sort of like drug war, maybe a social cleansing, and the particular sort of economic model adopted in Davao? Because it's my understanding that part of the appeal of Duterte is that he's been quite willing to sort of position himself on the left at times, like critique American imperialism or corporate interests, or even in some cases actually break with social conservatism.
Right. Yes, that's another peculiarity of the Philippines. Aside from the Communist Party of the Philippines, there's really no discernible ideological position of any politician. So in a way, a lot of them are pragmatists, and Duterte really is the quintessential pragmatist. So you're right. It's hard to pin his political positions. On one hand, he will say that he actually understands the left. In fact, he invited some members of the Philippine left to be part of his cabinet, only to not be confirmed by the Commission on Appointments later on. But that's a different story. But on the other hand, if you look at Duterte's economic team, these are your standard neoliberal professors of economics who implement his economic policy. So there's really, like, when we look at the actual policy, there's really no major difference from previous governments. But what I think is interesting with the Davao model is when I was talking to some Davao businessmen about how they feel about this, the way they explained it is, we're just willing to look the other way. We're just more than happy to be able to get our business permit very quickly. If we did this in another Philippine city, it will take 6 months. If we built our business in Davao, we get our permit in a month, which means a lot, right? If you're a businessman, if you're, if you're not a big multinational company, but you're a small business owner, that really means a lot. And the idea is that there are trade-offs. You just have to be willing to look the other way. And we see that on the national level as well. So when you have the head of the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry saying that the casualties in the drug war is a necessary evil, then, this is turning a blind eye, just looking the other way. So to that extent, I think there is complicity to the drug war. But having said that, I always make a point in saying, but guys, the Philippines is not an exotic case, right? If we ask ourselves, why am I not donating 1/3 of my salary to UNHCR or UNICEF? I can actually do something about global hunger. Why am I not doing anything about it? The polar ice caps are melting. Why are we not doing anything about it? So in a way, this is not so exotic. We know that the world is coming to an end, but we need to be complicit to some of these problems because life has to go on, right? So I try not to be super judgmental as well when people justify why they look the other way. We have to unpack what it is that makes them think it's okay.
Absolutely. I think it's important to understand why someone who we might find despicable holds some appeal amongst a mass of people. As to this question of a mass of people, I wanted to ask, who is his base? What is Duterte's base? Who voted for him? I think the usual perspective, certainly the kind of Western perspective, whenever a kind of strong man rises up, is that, this is just the revolt of the lumpens. But it seems that his base is much more amongst the new middle class. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. When we look at polling data when he was still running for president, the first socioeconomic class that actually threw their support behind Duterte is, you're right, these are the new middle classes. The poorest socioeconomic class actually either supported the other populist candidate, but populist in the traditional sense, like I'll give you extended welfare benefits, let's say for senior citizens or something. But yeah, that's not the initial base that Duterte had. And one explanation put forward by some academics is that it's because in the previous regime, most of the economic benefits either trickled down to the top 40 families in the Philippines that enjoyed unprecedented economic growth. Can you believe that? Only 40 families really made money out of the 8% economic growth. And the poorest communities who actually received conditional cash transfer. So I've witnessed this in my respondents. Like they hold their ATM cards, they guard it with their lives because they know that on this particular date, they have to go to the bank and then cash their conditional cash transfer, which matters because it used to be the case that they have to plead to the mayor or to the councilor or, find different networks to get the benefits that they deserve. So in a way, there have been programs that benefited the poor, but it's the middle class that really did not benefit from that economic growth. These are people who are stuck in traffic, stuck in very ugly airports, stuck in trains that are not functioning. So it's a lot of frustration. It's a lot of unarticulated frustration. And so when you have a presidential candidate who just says, motherfucker, I will fix this, I personally would say, yeah, please do it, damn it.
He does like to preface things with motherfucker, which is a good kind of lexical way of structuring your sentence, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has been a struggle for me when I read proofs of articles I write, because I have to think about, are they 2 words or are they just 1 word? I mean, what's the correct spelling of motherfucker? So apparently my editor said it's just 1 word for future reference, like public service announcement. But anyway, that's he articulates something visceral that really speaks to the middle classes. That's why his first supporters are from that class. But I think it's also not correct to limit it to that narrative. A while ago, I did mention his regional base, which is coming from Mindanao. And that is a very important voting bloc, I think. The first time I realized that this man might actually be president was when I was in Marawi, the city I talked to you about a while ago, the one that was captured by ISIS militants. I was there in January 2016. I was talking to young college students. A lot of them are conservative Muslims. Why they like Duterte. And this man makes jokes about women all the time. He's misogynistic. He's crass. He curses a lot.
I understand he also likes to make fun of God.
He likes him, well, not Allah, but just the Pope. But anyway, yeah, it was very interesting for me why these conservative young Muslims would like this man to be president. And their answer is, well, he gets us, right? He was able to, again, change Davao. I think he gets the rest of Mindanao. It's about time that we put someone from here to Imperial Manila and start fixing things because you idiots from Manila know nothing, right? So I think that's a very compelling narrative also. There's a regional factor to his popularity, which is very symbolic because this has been a region that has been underrepresented for a very long time.
So let me pick you up on what fixing things might mean, at least in political terms rather than economic terms. So I guess to what extent does his appeal rest on breaking with the kind of standard business as usual politics or with machine politics? Does his rule represent a challenge to clientelistic practices in the Philippines? Is he able to break with that if that's what he proposes?
No, really, not at all. During the campaign, there was, well, I have also observed this myself. There is a legitimate observation that his campaign is funded by ordinary people, and I did witness this. I went to remittance centers and saw young, like I think they're in their 20s, young teenagers getting remittance money from relatives from Saudi Arabia to print a poster that says, "Our family supports Duterte," right? And this is really crucial at that time because remittances during March is usually used for graduation season, to buy your clothes, to have a party, whatever. But now they're spending it to print a poster for Duterte. So that's a very compelling narrative that people are actually willing to use their own money to support a candidate, whereas before people are actually paid to wear a T-shirt saying that they support this candidate. Yeah. So to me, that was very moving. And that was a popular narrative at that time. But now it's starting to come out that Duterte is actually backed by elites that are also from Southern Philippines. So there are these very old names that have wealth way back from the Spanish colonial period, and new elites as well who benefited from Duterte's rule. So also quite questionable is Duterte's link to the Marcoses, who obviously are the family members of the former dictator. So that's also coming out now. So and when I looked at sample ballots, I don't know if this travels to other contexts, but before elections, people are given a sample ballot that shows them which boxes to shade, and they can bring it with them in the polling precinct. Duterte's name was in that sample ballot, right?
Wow.
And enclosed in that sample ballot is cash. So he's not definitely excused from machine politics, clientelism, vote buying. So I don't think his appeal is a radical break from that. If anything, he's just able to successfully tap on different sources of campaign income.
If I could just jump in here, just quickly, Nicole. If you're talking about his connection to old elites, powerful landed interests and old families and so on, if this exposure becomes more widely known, do you think there's a potential political weakness if it damages his credibility as somebody who poses as being outside the elite?
Right. Yeah, that's a tough one, right? Because there have been a lot of attempts by opposition figures, both elected and activist groups, to expose his corruption scandals. But it hasn't made a dent. And I think part of the reason for this is that he performs his simplicity really, really well. Like, this is a man who really shuns formality. He portrays himself as someone who eats dried fish during cabinet meetings. So his man of the people image is so performative. But let's not forget that, he's not poor. Jonathan Miller's book, Duterte Harry, Fire and Fury in the Philippines, actually has a very good portrait of Duterte's childhood, and his tough guy image is something that he developed by hanging out with his bodyguards when he was a teenager, right? So there's definitely no man of the people angle to Duterte. But that narrative of Duterte being a simple man, and you see this with his lifestyle, is not consistent with corruption allegations. But that said, it's not as if there is no evidence that there are lots of shady deals going on in his regime. So my colleague Kenneth Cardenas wrote a piece for the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. He looked at the contractors that bagged contracts for Duterte's big ticket items. And let's not forget that the main policy, economic policy of the Duterte regime is elegantly called build, 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 right? So very, very eloquent. And the idea is they want to usher in a golden age of infrastructure in the Philippines, and that will jumpstart economic development, building bridges, building airports, building seaports. But when you look at the contractors that actually bag these contracts, they are either contractors blacklisted by the World Bank for anomalous construction projects elsewhere, and others are companies that we've never heard of before. So there is evidence that we can actually question the track record of these new elites that benefit from Duterte's rule. But how that connects to the people might be a bit of a problem, because it's not directly associated to Duterte the man, right? It could be very much a structural issue of, just the general state of corruption in the Philippines.
I also understand that Duterte, like a lot of these other authoritarian leaders, has the presence of his family in politics. As you mentioned before, his daughter is the mayor of this city he formerly governed. And I also understand he has a kind of embarrassing son who may or may not be involved in some illicit activities. Is like the sort of family style politics a thing that you can really associate with him too?
Yes, he very much benefits from that family style politics. But I think a lot of people are just willing to, again, look the other way or be tolerant about it, right? Because this is, how do you say that? It's not new. It's not surprising. We've heard this before. So even if we hear a lot of accusations about his own kids being involved in drug smuggling operations, it doesn't really stick. And even Duterte makes fun of his own children in his speeches. So in a way, there's also this deniability.
That's
like he would shame them. Yeah.
I mean, that's better than Bolsonaro or Trump, I have to say.
Yeah.
But did Trump ever embarrass Eric or something?
Only in private.
Yes, in SNL maybe.
Yeah. Let me ask you about the development model, because I think when we talk about these new authoritarians, and we're talking about Duterte under that umbrella, there's quite a variance in terms of their political economic program. Duterte seems to be the most developmentalist of the lot of them. I don't know if you'd agree with that statement, but I think we do need to talk a little bit about this fact that he does seem to be much more of a national developmentalist than Bolsonaro, for that matter.
I'm not sure about what is Bolsonaro's context then. Is he more liberal, right? That's why some of the financial papers endorsed him too.
Yes, that's right. I mean, he's a long-term sort of nationalist, but hasn't really put forward a particular economic program. I mean, over the course of his time in Congress, but now recently he's a more recent convert to very hardcore neoliberal economics, and his economic advisor is one of the most extreme Chicago boys out there, who promises to privatize everything. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
he even worked for Pinochet.
All right, they are so back. Wow. Okay. Duterte is kind of, the economic policy is interesting in the sense that the whole idea is to spread the wealth throughout the country. So it's very much anchored on his anti-imperial Manila sentiment, which again resonates to areas outside Manila. So this is why federalism, for example, is one of his main policy proposals, which really isn't going anywhere at this point. But the idea is, to redistribute wealth away from the capital. And part of the policy that does that are the infrastructure projects I mentioned a while ago: high-speed rail, bridges, airports. Some of them are funded by loans. Some of them are funded by what they call the Swiss challenge type procurement, so getting unsolicited bids from foreign contractors. So I guess to that extent, you can call that developmentalist. But as far as questioning the Philippines' link to the global political economy, then I don't really see that much difference, right? I mean, there are some tokenistic, maybe not tokenistic, that's quite unfair, but there's really no, for example, a major policy against labor exportation. The Philippines, one of the Philippines' biggest industries is labor, sending people abroad. And I guess I'm part of that too, right? Because I'm a migrant worker. But yeah, he would do these very, I guess, meaningful ways to protect, let's say, distressed Filipino workers in Saudi Arabia and bring them back home. And, you know, it looks like a good victory of the nation looking after their people abroad. But really, it doesn't address the underlying reasons why the Philippines is very much part in the global political economy, in the way that it is part of the system now. So yeah, there has been no major pivot. So I would still characterize the Philippine economic system as very, still family driven, still very much concentrated on the hands of a few. And I don't think that, this regime is doing anything radical to dismantle those structures.
I mean, that's quite interesting to me, because over the course of the last few years, since he took power, I've encountered a weirdly larger number than I expected of like American leftists and international leftists who might like, oh no, he's killing people, that might be horrible, but at least he's an anti-imperialist, or like basically he's a national developmentalist. The Americans don't like him because he's standing up for his country, really sort of repeating sort of like this really crude, I think kind of comes probably from their associations with some of the Maoist parties in the Philippines. But like, this is some sort of like thing that you would definitely encounter on the left, and it doesn't sound accurate at all.
No, it doesn't. I mean, I personally really, felt entertained when Duterte was really throwing shade at the American colonial history. Like, he was questioning historical injustice from the American period. And I thought, yeah, totally. Or even when, even these his tirades against foreign leaders that meddle in the drug war, a part of me actually thinks, yeah, what the hell do they care? I mean, America hasn't gotten its drug war policy in order either, right? So this is where the appeal lies. He really taps on the injured ego of a lot of Filipinos who probably think that, why are you meddling with our country? But I think what's unfair about that assessment that, he rhetorically he speaks up against the US is he does it when it's convenient. I mean, let's not forget that this is the same man who sang a romantic ballad to Donald Trump during the ASEAN summit, right? And he likes Trump because Trump doesn't meddle. So I think his anti-foreign sentiment only goes as far as saying, don't meddle with my drug policy, don't question my human rights violations. But if they just let him do his thing, then he doesn't care. But there's even a bigger, longer history here that we can establish in relation to Duterte's human rights violations in the Americans. If we look at the patterns of torture and extortion that the police can actually do now, this is very much rooted in the American colonial period when they used the Philippines as a laboratory for their torture techniques, right? So there is this narrative of continuity that the very security sector that Duterte is using to kill his own people is the same security sector trained by the Americans to not get things in order. So I think it's quite unfair to say we can just, agree that the bigger picture here is you have this nationalist man willing to speak up against the US. I think he just does it when it's comfortable.
Sure. You mentioned history a second ago, and I did want to come on to that and place Duterte within the context of a longer Filipino history. There seems a tendency, and I guess this is something which doesn't just apply to the Philippines, but to relitigate history in new democracies, countries that have come out of a dictatorship in the past 30 odd years. This is definitely the case in Brazil, which is something that's very present in my mind. So I guess my question is regarding the kind of post 1986 redemocratization settlement in the Philippines. How much appeal does that have? He angered a lot of people, kind of being a little bit more open and appreciative to the Marcos regime. Is there a desire to return to that at all from a certain section of Filipino society? How does he relate to that?
If I can just, this is Philip, if I can just add to that, do people feel fed up after 30 years of democratic compromises and aspirations that have not been realized?
Yeah, definitely. The sense of being fed up is very much felt. There has been serious questioning about what precise gains has democracy actually brought to the Philippines. And the return of the Marcoses is actually interesting because, as a colleague, Cleaver Guedes actually argues, no, the Marcos aren't back. They never really left. I mean, unlike other post-authoritarian countries that actually litigated or had some form of truth and reconciliation commissions or justice commissions that investigates the atrocities of military regimes, the Philippines didn't really have that. Yeah, assets of the Marcoses were relinquished. They were convicted in some plunder cases, or some they were convicted in some courts for corruption. So that's been settled. But really, they never really left. With or without Duterte, I think the Marcoses are still very much part of the public scene. I mean, I made it my personal crusade that every time Aimee Marcos graces the cover of a fashion magazine in the Philippines, I would grab that magazine and put that to the horror section of the bookstore. I mean, that's where it freaking belongs, right?
Yeah.
But that's always been the case. They have been standard features of lifestyle programs. They have been so glamorized. The grandchildren that studied in the LSE are very much part of the very cool hipster scene of Manila. I mean, come on. The Marcoses have always been there. And what Duterte did is to actually just let them, appear again on the national scene, appear with the president on national speeches, profess loyalty to the Marcoses by giving concessions, like, for example, allowing the burial of the late dictator in the Cemetery of Heroes. So yeah, that's really a huge concession. But I think if there is one point of hope that we can focus on here, it's really that if you look at the surveys, the people who really feel nostalgic about the martial law are older people. The millennials actually don't like the return of the dictatorship. The millennials actually don't like or don't like the Marcoses that much. So I think, and if you looked at the protests against the Marcos burial, these are very young, woke millennials who are very creative in expressing their discontent. So I would say that there's still a very dynamic and vigorous contestation about what the legacy of the dictatorship is. I wouldn't just say that, Duterte just emboldened the Marcoses to be back in power, because the pushback is very strong.
So there is somewhere in the world where woke millennials are actually doing something right.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But of course, that's just not unique to the Philippines, right? I mean, Women's March in the US, for example, is really very much a product of woke millennials as well. People who support who lend their voices to the oppressed Rohingya refugees are also young Burmese activists. So, there is a lot of hope elsewhere in the world.
Just speaking on the sort of millennial question, isn't there also a degree that sort of like the other side of like the woke millennials is normally, we say the alt-right millennials, or sort of like the sort of neo-reactionaries? Isn't there sort of like an element of like young men, as you mentioned earlier, in that when you were citing the Muslim students in his region, also like really are behind this guy. He's like a macho dude. He says stuff that we like. He's a badass. And there's kind of like sort of legions of pro-Duterte trolls out there on the internet who are quite well organized.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I haven't observed a parallelism between, the alt-right, injured white male ego counterpart to the Philippines. If anything, the role that he performs, Duterte performs, is the drunk uncle. This is my favorite metaphor in populism studies. Like, the populist is that drunk uncle who attends a party, probably hits on the host, maybe gets a little bit too drunk, makes everybody uncomfortable. But he's familiar, right? He's the drunk uncle that everybody knows. So in a way, I think when I listen to how these, macho young men in the Philippines look at Duterte, they feel like, yeah, he's just one of those dudes. Maybe for some, he's an idol. Maybe for others, they think that he's a bit too crass. But I don't think he necessarily emboldens that kind of language to think that, it's so normal. Of course, you can have all of these Facebook and Twitter memes about or stories about how some men are just much worse now because Duterte made them that way. But, these are anecdotes. I think at least in my research, when I really do a deep dive of how people appreciate or assess the kind of language he has, I also hear a lot of people who are just like, yeah, whatever, he's just pretending to be badass. Let's assess him based on his actions. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are willing to ignore the crass language because they're counting on the action, right? So he will be assessed based on what he can do rather than what he says.
I mean, there's also this sort of like paradox, and I'm thinking about Bolsonaro in this case with this thing about actions, is that even when he does what he says, in this case, kill a lot of people, it's still like there's some distance between what he's saying and his actions, and there's a sort of like era, like he's this sort of floating lack of accountability for what he's doing. But more specifically, I want to ask another question, which is basically, is there resistance to his rule? Is there a organized left resistance? Is there some sort of ability to hold him accountable through, I guess, the fashionable term of yore was civil society, but I always hated that term, but through like unions, religious groups, student groups?
Yeah, definitely. I remember that on the first year of Duterte's State of the Nation address, so it's similar to the U.S. State of the Union address, on his first speech, the question was, where will the protesters be? At that time, the left was still allied to Duterte. We were asking the question of who will burn Duterte's effigy, because it has been an event, a ritual every year, the creative effigy that the left will burn. And so we kind of missed that. On his first year in office, the left was even invited inside the presidential palace to have a chat with the president. And that was actually pretty symbolic. You have indigenous people having a direct line to the president. But yeah, since that relationship soured, broke down, the left is very much at the forefront.
Just quickly, how did that relationship sour and break down?
Well, the peace talks that they have with the left is actually breaking down. There are a lot of irreconcilable differences. The people that he assigned in cabinet were not confirmed by the Senate. They just didn't get enough votes. So, and he started firing some of them for really strange reasons, which he normally does to some people anyway. So now that there's this moment where we call the usual suspects of activists, right, are just all out campaigning for Duterte, I think things are starting to change in the sense that resistance is now very much part of the agenda. But I think what's interesting about the nature of resistance against Duterte now are the more creative forms of resistance, again, that we see from the woke millennials. So, for example, we see spoken word poetry, rap music produced that criticize the drug war, and it's very emotional. We see theaters, plays that try not to criticize Duterte, but to bring to life the experiences of people who experienced the drug war firsthand. My favorite, actually, is a sticker that you can download online, and you're meant to stick it on a urinal, the campaign being piss at the dictatorship, right? So I think that's very clever. And if we can do a collective effort in printing Erdogan, Orban, Trump stickers and post them in urinals, then that's a fantastic movement, global movement to piss at the dictatorship. So I think there is increasing space against resistance, space for resistance against Duterte's rule. They're becoming very creative, very engaging. But the question I always get asked is, will you see a large-scale protest that we've seen in 86 and 2001 that actually have taken presidents out of power? I think that will be quite hard because in a way, the nature of protests has changed. And also, I think it's important to remember that taking out presidents in that manner didn't serve the country well either. There's a long and complicated history to that, but I think there's not an appetite to take out presidents through extra constitutional means again. And a lot of people are also gearing their energy towards electoral processes. So in the 2019, it would be the midterm elections. And so we see children of old activists in 86 now running for office to actually confront, for example, Amy Marcos, who's also running for Senate. So in a way, there's this rematch of dictators' children and activists' children fighting it out in the electoral arena. So that's also interesting to monitor.
It's funny how we see these past battles fought out again on kind of new terrain. To sort of wrap things up, I do want to return to where we started, which is how do we place Duterte in the global moment, in the global conjuncture? And do you buy the idea that there's a global populist, authoritarian, far-right wave, depending on how you characterize it? Is there a unifying factor? I mean, just from my own point, on my own thinking and researching and writing about these issues, I think the one thing that strikes me as being the one unifying factor is language. That the key populist praxis and universal source of appeal for populists is language, direct, unvarnished, brutal, gaffe-prone discourse. And that's something that Duterte exemplifies very well. Trump does. It's part of Bolsonaro's appeal. Is there anything more to it than this? Is there any other thing that you think in your research that can tie together figures as different as Duterte or Putin or Erdogan or Orban or Bolsonaro?
Yeah, I always find this question difficult to answer, and I'm always hesitant to make such claim that this is a global wave of populism, far-right wave. I think I'm hesitant to make such claims simply because I don't know enough. I mean, it depends who's part of the global that we are talking about here, because I think there's no doubt this is an issue because Trump is president, Brexit happened, white supremacist rhetoric is increasingly normalized in Europe. But that's not the world, right? I mean, this has been a constant feature of politics when we think of Berlusconi or Chavez or some crass African dictator. I mean, so a part of me actually thinks, are we just being super ethnocentric here when we talk about, it's the global wave because it affects us. But when it affected other societies, we really didn't care.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's, I think, my general, I guess, rant in that context. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not talking as an academic now, but a speculative citizen observer of politics. I think, in as much as we focus on these moral panics about, the very crass political leaders of the world, my training is in ethnography, so I do a deep dive in communities, and my lesson there's a good reason to celebrate democratic gains and micro-political achievements that we see in communities in subnational levels. We can see a lot of democratic experiments and democratic innovations, whether we're talking about Jacinda Ardern's New Zealand or Justin Trudeau's Canada, or even maybe Evo Morales' Bolivia, right? I mean, there are a lot of modest micro-political achievements that we can celebrate because I think, democracy works best with down-to-earth methods with incremental effects. So in as much as there's a lot of panic at the top, maybe there's a lot of reason to celebrate at the bottom.
Nicole, I think that's a brilliant place to leave it. Thank you very much. That was incredibly engaging, and I've got a whole page of notes that I was taking as we were going along. All right, that's it for now. Next episodes coming up are Alex Gurevich on douchebag entrepreneurs, Ishay Landa on The Apprentice's Sorcerer, and Will Davis on nervous states. Catch you later. Bye-bye.